Hey, this is Pablo Hidalgo from Lucasfilm, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Z, or Zed for Canadian and British listeners. This is the podcast you're looking for.
Jabba thanks you for delivering the Holo Diary.
No one would suspect that a lovely creature such as myself could do a bounty hunter's work.
Like its predecessor, Jedi continued to expand the cast of characters in the Star Wars saga.
What's that?
One of the biggest was intergalactic gangster
I know that laugh.
Jabba the Hutt.
This is Vanessa Marshall, Harrison Dula from Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
Joining us today for a very special cup of coffee. I guess that means you could put, it's got extra sugar. I don't know. We've got some great people on the show. We've got one returning guest and one brand new guest to Coffee with Kenobi. First, we will bring in our good friend, the amazing Kristin Baver. Kristin, welcome back to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Of course, we know Kristin from StarWars.com, author of multiple books, Star Wars Celebration host. It's always great to chat with you and to see all the fun things you're doing. So I'm really looking forward to breaking this book because I'm pretty confident you're a big fan of this particular character that we're going to talk about. It's going to be fun.
I am indeed, and I'm a big fan of this book as well.
Well, that's going to work out just fine. We also have now, we're talking, of course, about the amazing book that has come out, Star Wars from a Certain Point of View. This is, of course, the Return of the Jedi edition. So we have another author in addition to Kristin. We have Mr. Phil Szostak. Phil, welcome to Coffee with Kenobi.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, happy to
Of
be,
course.
long-time listener, first-time guest, I suppose.
Oh, I will take it. Thank you so much. Well, Phil, of course, is a Lucasfilm creative art manager, author of several books. We just talked before, one of the most fascinating and entertaining Instagram stories you will ever find.
Thank you.
A lot of great nostalgia. I think you did something for Battle of the Planets recently. Or it was either you or Pablo. I can't remember, but it was pretty cool stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I love jumping on there and sharing all my geeky pursuits, of which there are many, and they've been going for decades. So yeah,
love it. Well, there's plenty to choose from. Let's talk about this book. And Kristin, we'll start with you. For you, what is it about Return of the Jedi that is so tantalizing for a book like this?
So I've been a really big fan of this series since they first launched with From a Certain Point of View, A New Hope. I thought it was such a great way to celebrate the movie, but also really explore all of the menagerie of weird and wonderful characters that are part of that Star Wars galaxy. And for me, I think Return of the Jedi probably has the best grouping in terms of you want to talk weird and wonderful, just anybody in Jabba's palace. You throw a dart and you're going to hit somebody who's going to be super fun character to write about. So I think that's really what it is for me. It's just the almost endless amount of characters that could have been part of the 40 stories. And just knowing that also, of course, some folks chose to create characters or even, reimagine characters who aren't even necessarily in the film. So it's really just an endlessly creative exercise.
I love that. Yeah, throwing a dart is, especially at the beginning of the film, of course, with Jabba's palace, which takes the cantina to a whole new level. Phil, what about you? What is it about the third film in the original trilogy that is so great for a book like this?
Yeah, it's interesting. And thinking about the three original trilogy films, I feel like, Return of the Jedi probably has the most opportunities in its diversity of settings and just so many background weirdos, especially in Jabba's palace. And it's actually more similar in that way to A New Hope than it is to Empire Strikes Back. I imagine the authors for The Empire Strikes Back, from a certain point of view, had a particular challenge in that it really stays with the main characters. that film, and there's a huge chunk of the film where it's just Luke and Yoda, as far as, Luke's journey through the film. So it's just those two characters. So there was, I imagine that one was a challenge, just to find places to weave narratives in. And for us, I felt like Return of the Jedi was just a smorgasbord. There's just so many opportunities, especially in Jabba's palace, as I said. Yeah.
I'd also like to add to it that, and Phil, I think this is true for you as well, but when I was growing up, Return of the Jedi was my favorite movie, hands down, of the original trilogy. It was the one that, and I think for a lot of kids, it has elements that are really fun when you're a younger viewer, like the Ewoks and, other pieces to it. But I would count, Jabba's palace, that whole sequence, as part of that as well, that, as a kid, the first 30 minutes were probably my favorite. And so I think like that is also kind of a piece of that, nostalgia, and what makes it so exciting to be a part of this project.
I remember visibly going to Toys R Us and holding that Kenner Luke Skywalker Return of the Jedi action figure and looking at the back. And I think then they only had maybe 12 of the first figures that were highlighted. And there was Bib Fortuna. I didn't know who that was. Admiral Akbar. And you're thinking, what is going on? There's so many great ones to choose from, which makes me think, so all of you had to narrow down the characters that you selected for your story. And what was that process like to finally come to the ones that you actually chose for your stories?
For me, the character actually came first, and it was before the book. It was a story for Max Rebo, was something that I had already pitched to Mike Siglain without being attached to one book or a project in particular. So it really was Max Rebo first for me. And so when I pitched Mike that story, and he's the head of publishing at Lucasfilm, he loved it immediately. And my pitch was effectively, it's a combination. This is like the typical kind of Hollywood elevator pitch. It's like this and this. It's like Laurel and Hardy's The Music Box short, which is them as two piano movers. So that's very much like the Gungans in my story, combined with the origin story for Paul McCartney's Yesterday, where he dreamt that song, and just putting those two elements together into this, and also just wanting to express a bit of my own thoughts on the creative process, and especially the part of the creative process where you have a really good idea and you don't have an opportunity to jot it down. It's always at the most inopportune moments often that you get your best ideas. So just wanting to express those three things. And so I pitched that to Mike, and he was like, oh, I really would love to read that story or see that story if it had become like something visual. And then when, they were looking for authors for this book, I think Mike just remembered that I had this story, and him and Tom at Del Rey were the people that kind of made it happen for me. So it was always going to be Max Rebo for me. There was really no other choice.
I love that.
It's funny because when I got invited to join this project, the only character I was told I couldn't have was Max Rebo. Because of
really?
That.
Is that true?
That is true. Max Rebo was spoken for. I don't know what characters were spoken for, but I am
because your Max Rebo Maquette thing is sort of stuff of legend.
Exactly. Like I'm a fairly public Max Rebo fan, so I feel like the editors knew that and were like, just before you even say anything, Max Rebo spoken for. Which I already knew, of course, because Phil and I are friends, and we had been talking about that idea, just amongst ourselves. So it was just funny to see it in writing like that, though. Like any character, it's like we were talking about before. It's like any character you can imagine. What do you want from Return of the Jedi? Not Max Rebo, though, but anything else, which was great because I was really excited for Phil's story.
I just wanted to jump in and just quickly say that was in like February of 2022 that I pitched that originally to Mike. So it was kind of before all the authors had been gathered for the book. But sorry, go ahead, Kristin.
No, there's sort of a richness to Laurel and Hardy and the Gungans. What I'd never thought about that, but that's terrific.
Yeah, well, and I'm a big fan of like action comedy and silent comedies in particular, and Laurel and Hardy in particular. The Hal Roach Studios, that kind of brand of comedy is something that I've loved for a very long time. So that was just a natural fit for me.
And speaking of love for a long time, Kristin, I believe wasn't this announced at Celebration Europe who was working on who?
I think it was,
Does
although
that sound right?
it was on a panel and I was sitting next to Adam Christopher, but honestly, that's happened a couple of times now. So you could tell me it was any event
Right.
and I would be like, yes, that sounds right.
I'm
I
pretty
think that was
confident that it is because you
Yeah.
and I spent some time together at Celebration.
It was
And-
also because Little
Uh-huh.
Size Noodles was in my pocket the whole time.
I know.
packed her for England. She went on a little excursion with me just so I would
In
be
the
like,
window of the
ready.
train, right? Or
She
like
went on the train.
Yeah.
Yes, she had a whole little vacation there. Yes, but because I knew ahead of time that we probably were going to be able to, Adam and I, as the two people on the panel who were also part of this book, we're going to have a chance to reveal our characters a little early. So I wanted to make sure I had my my props and things. Yeah.
What is it that you love about this character?
Oh, what's not to love? You know, it's funny because Sai, like now that I've written that story, it's like it couldn't have been anyone else. I couldn't have done any other character. I can't imagine a world where I wrote a different story about somebody else. But at the same time, it wasn't not to say she wasn't my first choice, but I think once we got over the hump of no Max Rebo for me, I listed out a couple of options of characters that either were some of my favorites or off the top of my head I could already start imagining a fun adventure for them. And so Sai was on that list, but I don't think it was definitely not as simple as okay, Phil's going to write Max Rebo, I'll write Sice Noodles. What a great pair. But once I did get Sice Noodles, I became very protective of her. I've always been a fan of that character, but you spend some time really digging into who is this character in this moment and what's she thinking and feeling and what's she all about. And I started to get really attached to her in a new way.
Was the Clone Wars a big inspiration for you for this?
It was definitely one of the things I watched several times just to start hearing her voice correctly.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make sure I captured her in a way that if you were a fan of the original film with the puppet with the tusks, if you were a fan of the special edition where she got a bit of a makeover, or if you were a fan of her from the Clone Wars, it would all still kind of gel in a way that felt like they were all the same character in this story.
And I think that absolutely came through, honestly.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, of course. So I want to. This is a great opportunity for me because not only as a writer, but also as a teacher of writing at the high school and college level, I get to talk to two pros about the craft. So tell me, kind of compare writing a short story to other types of writing that you have both experienced and been a part of.
Well, for me, I really come from more the creative side of things. Kristin is a journalist by trade, and I am not a journalist by trade at all. I went to art school for film and animation and was always like a cartoonist and stuff. So telling these kinds of stories was more kind of hearkening back to another life of mine where I was, and I self-published my own comic books. So this kind of storytelling just felt very natural, and very different, obviously, than writing kind of a more journalistic piece like I do for the art books. But it was just tremendous fun and honestly fairly easy. It just flowed on out of me. I think I was really ready to do something like this because it had been a long time since I'd kind of exercised this muscle, even though I had been thinking about this story for quite a long time. And for months before I pitched it to Mike, I still, relished this opportunity and just had a ball writing it. And it really just flowed out of me like water.
Well, even the little things like remembering the little nuances of the grammatical aspects of dialogue and things like that, and keeping your dialogue tags fresh and, all that kind of stuff. Is there kind of a shift in your brain? It's or is it just sort of automatic?
I guess it was fairly automatic. And like I said, it had been something that I'd done semi-professionally when I self-published my own comic books.
Sure.
And, I would go to conventions and stuff, and so it was just a muscle that had maybe atrophied over time, but was still there.
Right.
And and I just love storytelling. You know, obviously everyone at Lucasfilm does to a great degree, but yeah, it was just something that I really was ready to do. I suppose ready to do again. You know, ready to try again. And yeah, so it was just an amazing opportunity to be creative in this storytelling way again.
Right. And for you, Kristen, I'm sure there's some similar aspects of this, but a short story is short. And I tell my students all the time, look, it's way harder to subtract than it is to add. And at first they don't believe me until they have some sort of an exercise. Did you find that to be true as well? Or I don't know, I'm sort of asking them from a metacognitive perspective, I suppose, but I'm really interested in your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So I will say for me, a little similarly, I think to Phil, when I was a kid, and I think this is true for most kids as they discover writing, but when I was a kid and I decided very early that I really wanted to be a writer, which is one of those things that I think kids, like I was 7, kids that age decide a lot of things, and whether or not they come to fruition is always really interesting in hindsight. But for me, I discovered writing. I really fell in love with it. I was creating characters, writing stories, and I was starting in that fiction space, as I think most children do. And then, as Phil mentioned earlier, when I went to college and then, graduated and started my career, I was a journalist, which is the complete opposite of that, entirely fact-based, entirely, if you want to write something, you have to source it, you have to find someone to prove it, you have to get the data set back for it. So just really interesting now to come full circle with this and kind of get back to the roots of what made me fall in love with writing in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I will say, I don't think for me, fiction is easier in any way, but I do think it is very freeing in a way that nonfiction isn't always. Because with nonfiction, if I don't know something, I have to go find the person who does know it, or I have to maybe admit that I don't know it in writing because everyone else is wondering the same thing. But in fiction, it's like, oh, I don't know something, make it up. Cool, done. So it is like simpler in that way. But then it's also a lot harder because, again, in nonfiction, you're asking all these questions as you're interviewing people, and they're kind of, based on the reporting, I would figure out what the story was, and the reporting would tell me, what the start of the story was, and kind of the flow of it. And here, that's entirely up to you. So that's actually so much harder because you're entirely responsible for those aspects. So it's almost an exercise in like interviewing these fictional characters in a way of sitting with them and figuring out, okay, what are they going to do next? What are they feeling right here? And really sort of like in an odd way, I think, and I see Phil nodding a lot, so I think he's in agreement here, but it's like when I was writing a story, it was almost me like asking, okay, Sai, what would you do now? What are you feeling now? Huh. And then like discovering the answer and then being like, okay, here's where we're going. And the story actually went in some places that I did not outline, or it went in some directions that I didn't necessarily plan for. And I think that's one of the real joys of writing in general, and for sure storytelling, where sometimes the broad strokes are still there, but some of the details or some of the elements that crept in as I was writing them, they were surprising me, which is a really wonderful exercise.
This is such a fun little masterclass. It's very organic, isn't it? This whole thing, the way it all connects together, the surprises that you come up with, and it becomes more of a fun surprise for the reader as well. Here's a debate that I have. So we'll just go true or false, and of course you can expand upon your reasons. Right? I want to see how I worded this properly. Coming up with a title is the easiest thing to do. True or false, Phil?
For me, that was, I wouldn't say it's the easiest thing, but it wasn't very difficult. And it's not something I tend to worry about when I'm writing. I tend to just kind of let it happen and think of it more of as an afterthought, like that it's not going to make or break the story for me. And I just assume that it'll come naturally once I'm done puzzling out the rest of the story. And that's pretty much what happened. Although I did have initially I had a working title, which was The Music Box, which is that Laurel and Hardy short.
Yeah.
That was my kind of just stick something in there. And then it was Scrambled Eggs was the title. That was the one I kind of was almost going to push for to continue to be the title, but it's too kind of meta because it's the name that Paul McCartney gave Yesterday before he came up with the lyrics.
Right.
So Yesterday originally was Scrambled Eggs. And I thought, maybe I can get away with it if it's because it's in the morning and he's hungry and maybe Scrambled Eggs is, might be good enough as a title. But Tom at Del Rey wisely was like, no, you got to come up with something that makes sense. So yeah, Fancy Man just made sense. And it also it's as a title, it's got layers of meaning because it's Max Rebo as a character is far from a fancy man.
Right.
So that's kind of the double meaning joke of the title is that and also people that don't know that Fancy Man is what Lapti Neck translates to into English, might just assume that's all there is to that title. And then if you discover later that the lyrics in the story, the English lyrics to Lapti Neck are things that are just pre-existing, that the song is in Huttese and that's the translation. Then
also, I'm sorry, far from a fancy man, he starts out in a white tuxedo. He is a fancy man.
I was going to say.
Well, but that is his dream, though. That's not him, and that's not him ultimately. That's not to give too much away.
That's how I see him. That's how I see him now.
Fancy Man just sounds like a throwaway title of a ZZ Top song, doesn't it?
That's very true, actually. I'd listen to that record.
Max Rebo with a long beard now, or we riot.
That's good. I can see him doing that. Well, so what about you, Kristin? True or false? Coming up with titles is the easiest thing to do.
In this case, it was very easy. My working title is the title as it stands, which is Satisfaction. However, I will say, I think a lot of that was due to, because I was so inspired by Sice Noodle's beautiful red lips and the connection behind the scenes to them adding, a Mick Jagger mouth to this character, and so wanting to, and also being a big Rolling Stones fan myself.
A direct quote from George Lucas. That was George Lucas's idea.
That was, and so to honor that, I think very early on in the stages of figuring out what the story was, I was listening to a lot of Rolling Stones, and it was very clear early that this was going to be a story about how dissatisfied Sice Noodles is with how her life has gone in this moment. So, and Satisfaction is just one of the greatest Rolling Stones songs ever. So, just both to have that reference for an if you know kind of moment, and also to really reflect what the arc was in this story. I think it fit perfectly from the beginning. So in this case, very easy. However, I will say that's probably not going to always be the case for me. And it is a tricky thing because, the title not that it can make or break a story, but the title can really make a difference for me as a reader of especially when you're flipping through an anthology, am I going to read this as one of the first, or am I going to skip over it because it doesn't really grab me? So, just finding something that is both enticing, but also, does tell the reader something about the story to come, can be very tricky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you're very much setting that stage, and it kind of reverberates, I think, through the reader's mind. I appreciate you both answering that, because I've always found titles and the name. I think character naming is also pretty challenging too. And this next one, I had Jim Butcher on last week with Dresden Files, and we talked a lot about the kind of the craft of writing too. And he had said, look, when I was in school, I was a literature major, and he was laughing at himself. And I kind of humored my professor, said I got to fill out all these character sheets and map out these chapters, and I got to do all these things. And ended up being his first book of the Dresden Files. So he didn't think that was going to make a big difference. It did for him. I've heard other authors say quite a different thing. So while it's we sort of address it, but when you're creating fiction, I know, Kristin, you said your story kind of evolved during the process, but there's really not a set way, is there? Because students say to me all the time, hey, how do you write a story? Well, I said, well, I don't know that there's really one. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. There's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I think one of my takeaways from this experience was that writing fiction for me is not that different from writing anything, because coming from that journalism background, you are taught early and reminded often that people have other important things to do with their lives and they are very busy. So either you're going to tell them everything they need to know in that first sentence, or tell them a first sentence so interesting that they read the second sentence, or they're going to turn the page and go on to something else. So having that kind of as the bedrock, I think, of all of my writing, you're for me, it's more a question of how can I get you to be really excited about this first sentence, and then every sentence after that to just keep the flow, keep following, and not taking for granted that just because I wrote it, anybody's going to read it till the end.
What about you, Phil?
I'm sorry, could you so just so you know, my video is acting a little weird, so I don't see Dan, I only see Kristin. But we can obviously cut this bit out, but
I'll move my mouth while Dan talks this time. So
yes, it'll be fun. We've done it before. We've done shows.
But yeah, just so you know what's happening, that in case I mute or cut out or disappear or whatever.
Yeah, no problem.
Is it one of your views? If you do you see the views button, Phil?
Yeah, no, I can't hit the mute button now. I can't hit the views button.
Oh, okay. Because if you hit views, it'll say dynamic is one of them. I bet you have me on Spotlight.
No, I don't actually. Oh. Yeah, no, it was dynamic before, and now it's not.
I always put on grid. Anything. Grid was the best because everybody's small and it takes up less space.
Yeah, I'm sorry though. Could you just repeat the question, please?
Of course. Yeah, no. Basically, what I talked about was the process of creating fiction. Do you use do you map out different chapters or concepts or ideas? Is it more of you just sit down and do it, or kind of? And I tell my students it's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's sort of different, but there are different things that work for different people for different reasons.
Yeah, I think for me in the fiction space, and Kristin can attest to this because I kind of kept over and over pitching my story and adding things to it, and throwing new ideas past her as I was thinking about it over the months. And for me, yeah, I put a lot of, and it's actually the same for my art books too. I kind of put a lot of thought and do a lot of prep work before I actually start writing. I want to feel like I have a pretty solid roadmap of where I want the story to go before I even put pen to paper or start, not literally. I don't actually use pen and paper, but you get the idea. So for me, it's a lot of thought and prep. And then when I start writing, I kind of just want to keep going. Which is probably why I do all that prep. So it just kind of flows and flows. So yeah, I knew the bones of this story, but was also, willing to just let it lead itself as well. And there were things that, as Kristin was saying, that surprised me along the way. But generally, I kind of knew the basic. I guess what I'm saying is I'm kind of like a structure guy, and I like feeling confident in where the story is going before I even get going with the actual process of writing. So
is that what you mean by prep, like sort of an outline or something like that?
Yeah, but I don't, for my art books, I definitely have a really extensive many page outline, just so I can kind of just keep tracking of where I am and what needs to, be in the book next. But in this case, it wasn't, I did have some notes in my phone and things like that for this, but no real doc that I was kept referring to while I was writing or anything like that. I kind of just had it all in my head.
Right.
And really, I think I just need a little bit of confidence in where things are going before I can kind of take that first step and write that first sentence. So that's kind of, that's how writing is for me, just generally, I suppose. It's not something I've really thought about too much before.
Sure.
So I'm glad you're asking.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's the teacher side of me, I guess.
Well, and I'll add to that I do think short story planning is quite a bit different from planning something on the longer side of fiction, because I do really need to have more structure and outlining and understanding of, the whole story arc to make sure that I'm hitting everything I want to hit. If it's longer fiction. With a short story, I feel like it's so condensed, like you were saying before, it is, it's harder in some ways, but then also it's very much, typically, I think a point A to point B kind of story, there's not time really for a whole lot of scene changes and new characters and perspectives and other things going on.
And connecting all those threads, because for this, you had one important thread that it kind of makes the whole thing happen. This one I'm really interested in your answers on for a lot of reasons. You obviously are both fans of these characters, that you were able to create some new adventures for them and some new sort of points of view for them. But what did you learn and appreciate about these characters through the process of writing these stories? There must have been something that came up where you thought, "Oh, I never thought about it that way before," or something that you realized made them extra special to you, because now you're stuck with them. They're ingrained in you now.
Yeah, for me, I've always, my dad was a musician, and music is another big passion of mine, and I'm friends with a lot of musicians, and I feel like I really understand. There's like definite parallels between my creative process as a writer and a cartoonist and an artist, and the act of creating music, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. So writing a story with a musician at its center felt really natural, and it felt like something that I could speak to with some understanding and authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just kind of a delight to have a character like that. But as far as like who Max is, and like, I really took a lot of inspiration from what had come before. So I don't feel like I necessarily, it was more being true to what had come before, and also putting my own goofy spin on it and I really set out to write something that was funny and comedic, and with action too. And I'm not only a fan of like silent comedy, but also love like Hong Kong action comedy, like Jackie Chan and stuff, which if you've
Sure.
ever seen my Instagram stories, which are filled
Absolutely.
with it. But so yeah, just so that part of it, I guess, is my own spin on it. But otherwise, yeah, I don't know if there's a lot to discover, honestly, about Mac.
Right.
Because he's a pretty simple-minded person who's driven. He's like as I say in the story, he's like a simple-minded sensualist. Like someone who's driven by the rumbling in his tummy, and
so he's not Hamlet, is what you're telling me.
No, but that's a fun kind of archetype. Well, it's not even an archetype. It's just a fun kind of character to center
around. Yeah, I totally get that. Kristin, what about you?
The Max Rebo slander on this call. My goodness. The Max Rebo slander. How dare. No. Can you repeat the question for me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So I'm interested in knowing, what is it about about Sai that you appreciated even more than you had before because of the process of writing her story?
Yeah. I think the big standout to me was going into it. I didn't expect her to be so relatable in the way that she turned out to be, for me at least. I don't know if everybody finds that to be true as they're reading the story. But I think it was one of the surprises. I was so pleasantly surprised to find that she was so relatable. Just felt like so many other strong female characters that I'm also a fan of in Star Wars, but looks a bit different than a Leia or a Rey. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway for it. But one of the things I also kind of set out to do, I guess, that came up was in the Clone Wars arc. She's very much kind of that classic femme fatale.
Mm-hmm.
And so in telling her story, I wanted to kind of really dig into, how much of that was conjecture, how much of that was true for her, what's her side of the story with the whole Zero the Hutt thing. And even though we don't get into Zero a lot in it, there is a fairly important Zero moment, which I won't spoil. And I think that was another kind of pleasant surprise for me in terms of learning something about her that, maybe if you just watch the Clone Wars story, maybe that's not the full story according to Sai.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. I love that. Here's something I feel like when you create, I feel like there's two ways to really learn something. You either teach it or you write about it. And in a way, you've done both. You've both done both with these characters, with this saga, with this mythology. Have you watched Return of the Jedi since you wrote these stories, and how did it impact your viewing experience?
I have not, but part of, I don't think I have, at least, but I did watch it quite like a couple of times during the writing process. But I think even during that process, because so much of the story was already very much alive in my mind, even though I hadn't written it out yet, it was starting to change the way I was viewing Sai, during the big musical number, the way Joe Yauza just blows right in and steals her spotlight. And also that moment where Ula goes into the Rancor pit and Sai just goes, "Ooh," it's like all of those pieces that start to stand out to me in a different way.
What about you, Phil?
I have not watched it in full, but as a part of my, just my day job with the story group, I am constantly looking at the films and our shows, just to refer back to things and refresh my memory. And so I have Disney Plus open all day long, and it's such a boon because it's like very easy to scroll and see exactly where in the film you are. Back, in the early days of working for Lucasfilm, we had just had quick times of the films, which was, less than ideal, although still handy. But yeah, no, I'm constantly, so I'm sure I've looked at bits and pieces of Return of the Jedi, but I've definitely not looked at it in full. But like Kristin, I really scrutinized the movie to make sure I got all the details right while I was writing. And even as in my story, how it opens with the sail barge explosion, my story, spoiler alert. And even just how the barge, there's two kind of explosions that happen within moments of each other, but it kind of gave me an opportunity for Max to slide on the surface of the sail barge and almost fall into the pit, because you see the whole sail barge lurch after the first kind of explosion before the big one that totally destroys it. And I was like, ooh, there's an opportunity there. So just really, really very, scrutinizing it that closely, even within moments, just looking for opportunities. So yeah, it was something I really looked at very closely to make sure, and of course looked at every scene that Max was in, and there's only so many, but still it was a lot of fun to rewatch it and also just really scrutinize it. And also, as we've discussed, reread all of the Max stories, the comic book, stories, and also the short stories, and the band played on the band's tale from Tales of Jabba's Palace is something I read very closely, and it was a lot of fun to reread after so many years.
There's a lot of richness in it, and I truly appreciate the joy that you bring to it, because I think both stories are just a lot of fun, and they're just you're taking the characters seriously, but not yourself seriously. You're just having a great time playing this wonderful Star Wars sandbox, and it very much comes through in these wonderful stories.
Listening to Coffee with Kenobi, you are, with Dan Z, the podcast you're looking for. This is...
Besides this awesome book, what can the two of you share about what else you've got going on and what we can look forward to in the future?
Kristin, you probably should go first, because you always have things just in my position within the company. It's sometimes there's a lot of things going on for both of us, but I think
sure that you can share. Yes.
Exactly. That's always the rub. That's always the rub. But Kristin tends to have more things that she can share.
Well, that's the fun thing about this show. We're so anti-spoiler that even if you were going to tell me, I would say nope, and I would disconnect the call, because I like being surprised. So
yeah. I think for the first time in a while, I don't have anything that I can add to that.
All right.
Seriously. But I will say that I am always writing.
Always on the move.
always on the move, but like writing is such a big part of my day job with StarWars.com. And I've also found, I think this story really reignited my love of fiction writing as well, and reminded me how important it is for me to write, as a way of expressing myself, as a way of kind of, sometimes working things out in my brain that, they're puzzling to me. But if I write it out, or start a story of some kind, maybe that'll kind of give me some clarity. Mm-hmm. So I'm always writing. And if there's anything to say in the future, I'm sure it'll be on StarWars.com.
We look forward to that. And we always look forward to your articles on StarWars.com as well. Phil, what about you, bud?
Yeah, definitely a distinction between our day jobs, me and Kristin's day jobs at Lucasfilm. Mine's much more design focused and just looking at designs pretty much all day long. And one thing that was very timely that I was working on very intensely for the last, year and a half or something was Young Jedi Adventures. Just looking at those designs like several times a week, both like in concept art form and in CG models. Just kind of really making sure that that's all staying true to what came before in Star Wars. And that's a joy and a really cool part of my job with the story group is just getting to see all this amazing concept art and give my little notes on it and just put my own little stamp of approval on everything that we're doing at the company as far as our design work goes.
Love it. Well, if people want to reach out and say hello or just thank you for your wonderful work, where's a good place for them to do that?
The best place to find me the best places to find me are on X, formerly known as Twitter, and also Instagram are two good places to find me.
I've mostly migrated to Instagram and Threads at the moment. Threads seems to be the place where people are hanging out. We'll see if that sticks. But you can always find me at Kristin Baver, assuming that you can spell Kristin Baver.
And that's the same for me too. If you can spell Szostak, you'll find me.
Yes.
But if you pick up from a certain point of view, the names are right on the cover. We've done the work for you.
The only way to do it is to buy the book, everybody, and you'll love it anyway. It's great storytelling. Thank you both so much for sharing your stories on Coffee with Kenobi.
Thanks you for having us.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.